This talk is informed by psychological research, but it is not a research talk. This is an activism talk. So there are charts and graphs and figures and citations and all that good stuff behind what I'm talking about, but I'm really not going to spend any time on that at all. Happy to give people more information or go into details or clarify afterwards. But mainly what I'm hoping to do today is to convey some of the most important insights from psychology and then talk about how we can use them to talk about climate change with other people in a way that inspires action and helps us fight the despair that I know we are all battling every day. So I want to start by there we go. I want to start by inviting you to do a gut check. So I'm going to make a statement in a minute. And what I want you to do is just tune in and notice what is your very first physical and emotional reaction. Okay. So the statement is, yes, we can effectively take action on climate change. So if you care to, you could put in the chat so other people can see, what was your reaction to that? Were you like, yeah, totally? Or did you have a sinking feeling? Or did you have an ambivalent feeling? The way I respond to that question actually depends on the day, right? But one of the main points that I'm going to make in this talk is believing that we can take action on climate change is really important. It's actually essential to motivating action on climate change. So to give you a quick overview of where I'm going to go today, first I'm going to assert that yes, we can do this. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why I remain optimistic. Then I'm going to present a perspective on human motivation that I find really, really helpful in not just my research, but in my everyday life. I'll talk about how we cope with threat. And then I'll finish by talking about how we can put all those things together in a useful way. So I want to start by acknowledging that I am an optimist, but I'm not an idiot. And so I want to acknowledge that we're in a really bad situation. The things that have happened in the last year alone really highlight just how tenuous it is to keep a habitable planet. And we also don't have very much time. So the picture there that you're looking at is a clock that is in Times Square that ostensibly is counting down the years, days, and hours that we have to take serious action on climate change before we pitch into climate collapse. We can argue about whether it's 7 years, 8 years, 5 years, 10 years. The point is it's not a lot of time. So that's the hard truth about where we're starting from. But I want to emphasize that even though it looks bad and it's dire and we've got to act really, really quickly, I am still optimistic for a variety of reasons. So first of all, we need to remind ourselves that literally everywhere, at all levels of government and all corners of the globe, people of all stripes, ages, creeds, ethnicities, religions are searching for solutions to climate change. People are investing and developing new technologies. People are developing new ways of farming. People are developing new ways of delivering and organizing things. People are developing new ways of using the arts to inspire action. So there are literally millions of people working on this problem right now. They're not getting attention. We don't see them, but they're out there. There are also a lot of technical solutions that are ready and standing by. So this is a super, super short list. But for example, we are now at the point where renewables are cheaper than coal. They have a market advantage. There are researchers who are developing these plants that could be grown on the sides of buildings in cities that absorb tremendous amounts of CO2 and then could be fed to livestock. I just read an article the other day that nuclear fusion may actually be a reality within the next 5 years. So there's some really exciting technological things happening. There are also a lot of very simple behavioral strategies that we can engage in right away. And I'm sure many of the people listening to this talk are already doing some of these things. Being really careful about not letting wasted food go into a landfill where it produces methane, eating a more plant-based diet, working from home. I think a lot of us have been doing that of late. There are also a lot of policy solutions, a lot of really smart people working on policy solutions. I don't know how familiar you all are with the Citizens Climate Lobby, but they're a tremendous organization working to develop bipartisan climate legislation and a fee and dividend approach to dramatically shifting our energy market. So a lot of really, really great stuff is happening out there. And we actually have the tools and the wherewithal that we need to do what we need to do. So, but yet we still haven't solved the problem. We're still in this crisis situation. And so what we have to realize here is that the problem is a people problem. It's not an idea problem. It's not a technology problem. It's not even a money problem. It's a people problem. So you may, at this point, say, why am I optimistic? Because we can look around us and see people doing some pretty terrible and pretty crazy things. Well, as a psychologist, I still remain optimistic. And it's because of a couple of things. First of all, humans can respond and adapt and change our behavior faster than any living organism ever. This is our evolutionary genius. We don't need to wait generations for our DNA to change for us to be able to use some new behavior or develop some new biological feature. We can change in minutes by communicating with each other, the power of ideas. So it's true, we haven't taken the action that we need to take yet, but the pieces are in place and change can happen incredibly quickly. Think how quickly our entire world changed in response to COVID-19. The other thing is that people are fundamentally social and we're fundamentally pro-social. We care about each other and we need each other. And I think these two things, our tremendous ability to adapt quickly and our genuine dependence on and concern for each other, are the key that make it possible that we're actually going to pull this out. Now, we might not. I'm not convinced 100% that we will do it, but I know that we can do it. So let me now introduce to you a perspective that I use literally every day. And it helps me think about what really motivates human behavior. And we in our capitalist society tend to have a narrative that people are lazy and selfish and motivated by self-interest, and mostly that means money. And it's not that we're not motivated by money, and we are sometimes self-interested, but there's a lot more to us than that. So I don't know how many of you recognize what this is. This is a Cabbage Patch doll. And when I was younger, Cabbage Patch dolls were all the rage. So each one is supposedly an individual. So it comes with a birth certificate, different clothes and hair and different name. And there was one Christmas where Cabbage Patch dolls were flying off the shelves and parents could not get their hands on these things. And their children desperately wanted one of these dolls for Christmas. And so you have these situations where parents would get up at 4 in the morning, they would go to Macy's and they would stand outside in the parking lot in the sleet and the cold and the dark and the snow, so that when Macy's opened at 6 a.m. on Black Friday, they could elbow their way past all the other parents and run to the toy section and grab one of these objectively ugly dolls off the shelf for their kid. That's really not rational behavior, if you think about it, right? That's weird. And if you look around, there are many, many examples of humans doing uncomfortable, crazy things for something that they really care about. So here we're seeing people sleeping out all night long to get concert tickets for a rock band. Every year, people will go through humiliating, uncomfortable, nauseating hazing rituals so that they can become a part of a group. Here we see people who have painted their body blue for their sports team. And sadly, there are times when people will strap bombs to their bodies and blow themselves up. Those are powerful motivations that have nothing to do with self-interest. These are powerful motivations that we need to understand. We need to tap into that kind of motivation to fight climate change. So how can we understand what's going on in those examples? Well, this is fundamentally an evolutionary perspective. So human beings, we have, of course, biological motives that strongly drive our behavior, but a really important feature that allowed us to survive as a species was our ability to work in cooperative groups. So we are obligatorily social creatures. We have to have other people in order to survive. So for our ancestors, being a member of the group was literally a matter of life or death. And what that meant was that we had to evolve not just some biological motives to keep our bodies alive, but social motives to keep our membership in the group alive. So we evolved these core social motives because they're adaptive, because they work, because the members of our ancestors who were motivated to keep their membership in their group were more likely to survive and to pass on their genes. And, you know, think about how irritating other people can be. Think about a committee meeting or whatever, and people are being really, really annoying. There's got to be something holding us together, right? So these motives evolved to hold us together. So the motives I'm going to talk about have been extensively studied. You find them in every culture. These are fundamentally human motives. However, of course, there are lots of different ways that we can meet these motives. So you might find different cultures pursuing them in really different ways. But under it all, these are all things that motivate human behavior. So what are these 5 core social motives of behavior? Psychologists have slightly different lists, but this is one that I find works really well for me. The first and most important one is the need to belong. We need each other. We cannot survive without human contact. In fact, there is this apocryphal story of a king back in the, I don't know, 12 or 1300s, who conducted an experiment. He wanted to know what language babies would spontaneously start speaking if they weren't taught something from their parents. And of course, the answer was going to be Latin. So this king recruited a handful of babies, and they were fed and they were changed, but they weren't held, they weren't talked to, and they all died within a few weeks. We need human contact. There have been some case studies of people kept in solitary confinement for extended periods of time, and it is literally the worst possible thing you could do to a human being. People in solitary confinement lose their mind and they lose themselves. They start to hallucinate. They will fly into blind rages over things that aren't there. Eventually, they go into a catatonic state. Their physiology and their brain waves start to shut down. And they're permanently damaged. When people come out of solitary confinement, it's not something that they can easily recover from. So it's been said by many people, including the late John McCain, that being tortured physically was not as bad as being in solitary confinement. So we need each other. There are 2 more cognitive motives. One is the need to understand. We need to feel like the world has some sense to it, that we can predict what's going to happen. And we also need to have some sense of control, that we can have an impact on what's going on around us. Then there are 2 that are more emotional. We need to feel basically worthy. And we need to feel good about the people around us. We need to feel safe. We need to feel like we can trust the people that we're with. Think about a time when one of these things was being challenged. So maybe you were left out, you were purposely excluded from something, or maybe you were in a situation where it didn't matter what you did, you couldn't change the impact. Or maybe you were surrounded by people that you knew you couldn't trust. Those are really negative experiences. And so when that happens, we are highly motivated to do something about it, to fix it. And that helped our ancestors maintain their status in the group and to maintain the functioning of their groups. So I want to call out two important insights for our topic here tonight. The first is that we will sacrifice and suffer for people other than ourselves. We can, in fact, ask people to make big sacrifices for climate change. We will do it. The second is to notice what happens when our core social motives are thwarted, when we feel like we can't get these basic core social motives met. And so whenever you bump into someone who is being defensive or angry or irrational, or they're like taking something way too personally and they're freaking out about it, I bet you what's going on is that situation feels like a threat to them on one or more of these core social motives. Maybe they feel completely disrespected. Maybe they have had the rug pulled out from under them and their understanding of reality has been challenged. Those are really negative experiences. And so when people are resisting and when people are reacting in what seems like an irrational way, what's really going on is they're just being human and they're reacting the way any of us would to a threat. So I find this really helpful for a couple of reasons. First of all, as we're doing our climate activism, we're going to run into resistance. And it's really tempting to dismiss people who are being resistant, dismiss them as crazy or irrational, to denigrate them, to think of them as stupid. And that's actually, not only is it not helpful, but it's not accurate, right? If we can remember that they're just humans, just like us, then we can often think about and identify, why are they reacting that way? What's the underlying threat? And is there another way that we can address that threat and still move forward with our climate activism? So let's also ask ourselves, how does the threat of climate change impact these motives? When you think about the threat of climate change, what does that do for you in terms of your belonging, in terms of your understanding? How does it make you feel? For me, thinking about the threat of climate change is actually a challenge to all of these, especially control, right? Climate change is such a huge problem. It's really hard to feel like you have any kind of influence. And as we'll see, I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we face. Now let's look at it through the perspective of someone who's denying climate change. How might climate change denial help fulfill these motives? If you're a climate change denier, you know who's with you and you know who's against you, right? You know who your in-group is. The world makes sense. You don't have to think about things changing to be able to predict what's going to happen. You have a sense of control because the world is going to keep going on the way it always has. You don't need to feel bad about yourself for driving a car, right? You can feel good about yourself. You're not contributing to a problem because there is no problem. And you can feel safe, right? The world is just going to keep going on the way it is. It's understandable why it's a kind of appealing perspective. Now think about how engaging in climate change activism helps fulfill these motives. It's a fabulous way to fulfill your core social motives. And that's one of the pieces of good news here, is that by coming together to work on a problem like climate change, not only can we solve the problem that we need to solve, but we can be tremendously fulfilled. This is something that is good for each and every individual. When you join a group, you have a tremendous sense of belonging. You are with a group of people who are helping to build an understanding about how to move forward. When you come together as a group, you have more impact and influence over the world. You feel great about yourself, and you're with people you know you can count on. So one goal that I think we all need to have is to make our activist efforts as psychologically fulfilling as they possibly can be, because that's where we get the motivation to keep going when things get hard. So what I want to do now is introduce to you a perspective on understanding how we respond to threat. And it's called protection motivation theory. You don't need to remember that. That's not the important part. And so we're just going to think through. We're looking at a threat. What do? Do we ignore it? Do we try to prevent it? Do we freak out? So according to this model, we ask ourselves several questions. First, we ask, how likely is this bad thing to happen? And if it does happen, how bad is it going to be? Those two things combined form our threat appraisal. How bad is this threat? How worried should I be? And then we ask ourselves, can I prevent this? Is there some behavior I could do that would prevent this from stopping? And if I do that behavior, is it actually going to work? And those two things come together and form our coping appraisal. It's the combination of these two things that determines whether we're going to be motivated to take action. So if we think, wow, there's a problem, but also, and I can do something about it, then we're motivated to take action. So it's important that those two things be in balance, right? So if the threat is huge and overwhelming, and our sense of our ability to cope is small and weak, we're not motivated to take action. It feels hopeless. It feels like there's absolutely nothing I can do. And I think that that's a place where a lot of us struggle to not go to, right? I think a lot of the general public is actually concerned about climate change, but so overwhelmed by the threat that they're paralyzed. On the other side of the coin, if you deny the science and believe that climate change isn't going to happen, you're not worried at all. Or you might have an overly confident sense that a higher being will fix it, or there'll be a magical technological solution that will fix it. And so you might have an outsized sense of ability to cope, right? In either of these situations, you're not going to be motivated to take action. So one important point to take home for climate messaging is that how we need to communicate actually depends on each person's sense of threat and coping. And so this is the bad news part. There is no magic bullet. There's not one magic thing we can say that will make everybody suddenly want to spring into activism mode. So we need to think a little bit about what's the level of threat and what's the sense of coping that somebody is feeling. And let's again take a look at the denier's perspective. So the denier says that's not going to happen, or even if it does happen, you know, climate fluctuations are natural, and I think warmer winters would be nice. So I'm not worried, right? So they're not motivated for action. So their problem is on the threat side, right? But we also have some doomsayers out there, right? And so the doomsayer says, there's nothing I can do, and if I did it, it wouldn't make a difference anyway. So their appraisal is, there is no escaping this impending disaster, so I'm not even going to try. So two different routes, two different sources of inaction that would require two different approaches to talk to that person. So how much energy should we give the climate change deniers? I don't know the answer to this question. I will share these facts with you. Currently, these are very, very recent polls. 78% of Americans believe in climate change. 64% of Republicans believe in climate change. And this is an increase of 8% in the last 4 years. So the percent of people who don't believe in climate change is shrinking and shrinking fast. just for a little bit of context, I also looked up how many people believe in extraterrestrial contact. And 33% of Americans believe in UFOs contacting people on Earth. So that, you know, with that perspective, we're doing pretty good with climate change. So my sense of it is, don't spend most of your energy talking to a small group of people. Later on, if we have time at the end, I do have a few slides that I can go over where I say a little bit about what to say to a climate change denier. But I'm going to take my own advice and not spend a lot of time on that. I'm going to instead focus on how we talk to the 78% of Americans who actually do see a threat. So remember that there's got to be that balance between threat and coping, right? Every threat message needs to be paired with an efficacy message. So efficacy meaning, do you feel like you can do it? If we are sharing scary information about the climate, you know, the polar ice caps going crazy, melting quickly right now, right? Or the tundra in Siberia, the permafrost is melting, some really scary stuff. If we're talking about that stuff, but we don't also talk about solutions, we are really encouraging people to just psychologically shut down. This stuff is scary. And if we can't at the same time realize that there are paths forward, it's really hard to not just disengage. So what should we say to people who are concerned? And I have up here talking to doomsayers, or really anyone who is paying attention, because anyone who reads climate science knows that the doomsayers are not 100% wrong, right? So these people who believe in climate change, they're all set with a threat appraisal, right? We don't need to tell them how bad it's going to be. They're worried already. What we need to do is we need to focus on the coping appraisals. We need to focus on helping them feel like they can do the behaviors that they need to do, and that those behaviors are actually going to have a positive impact. So another really important point here is to recognize the fact that climate change is a collective problem. It is not something one person did. It is not something one person can solve. And so when we're talking about encouraging people to engage in solutions and do things to help fight climate change, there's really a mismatch, right? You should do this one little tiny thing of taking your reusable shopping bag to the grocery store. It will actually help fight climate change, but wow, it's a really, 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 really tiny thing in the face of such a giant problem. So I think there's been this history of talking about, you know, 50 small things you can do, and focusing the individual on these little things. And the idea there was to empower people but not inconvenience them. Well, I don't think that was so smart, because anybody can easily see that those teeny tiny but convenient things they're not big enough to address the threat, right? We can help solve that problem if we focus on the collective nature of the problem and the collective nature of the solutions. Collectively, we are tremendously powerful. And so my suggestion is not to talk about what you as an individual can do, but to talk about what we as a collective force can do. So think about the person who's worried about climate change. They're not a member of the Kent Environmental Council. They don't have this tremendously wonderful community of people, but they're sitting at home wringing their hands, and they're worried. But they look around them and nobody's talking about climate change. Their neighbors don't really seem to be doing anything different, right? It seems like nobody else cares. And so they might come to the conclusion that, well, they could, you know, maybe they could start biking to work, or they could turn their thermostat down, or they could buy a Prius. But if they're the only person that does it, it's not going to make a difference. And so they wind up concluding that they can't cope, that we can't cope, that the problem can't be solved. And then they're not motivated to take action, right? So we've got to break out of this cycle. And the key to that is to focus on the collective, that yes, we can. So we need to really funnel our energy and attention into these collective solutions. Now, I don't want to say that individual actions don't matter, because they do. And they matter for a couple of reasons. 3 reasons. First of all, they matter because every little bit matters, right? So every time you bike instead of drive your car, you have reduced a little bit of carbon. Second, they matter because when a bunch of people do that, it adds up to a bigger effect. There's a third reason why it matters, why those individual actions matter. When you engage in pro-environmental behavior and climate change fighting behavior, you are sending a message to everyone who sees you that you care about this issue. And that helps to create that sense of communal concern and communal action that can build that feeling of communal efficacy that says, yes, we can do this because I'm not alone. I look around and I see lots of other people doing it. And that feeling that everybody else is with us is incredibly powerful. Now, we also need to talk about the collective concern. Now, this group may be not the normal, but my sense is that most Americans don't go around talking about climate change and how worried they are about it, right? We don't want to be a downer, or we don't know if someone's a denier and we don't want to get into an argument with them. So we don't talk about it. And so that can create this false sense of security, false sense of, oh, nobody else is worried about it like I am. So we need to talk about it with each other. We need to share our concern. And because if we know that other people are concerned, we will be more likely to think they will take action, which in turn makes us more likely to take action. There's research showing that the people who think other people don't care about climate change are less likely to take action, not because they don't care, but because they think other people don't care. So knowing that you care is important for your neighbors. That will make them more likely to take action. I want to come back and remind us about the core social motives that I identified earlier. And this becomes particularly important when we're thinking about resistance behavior. Let's think about someone who is a coal miner, someone whose family has worked in the coal mines for generations. We want to take their whole world away from them. We want to change everything. We want to take away their sense of identity, their sense of understanding, their sense of control, their sense of esteem. It's a pretty big ask to ask people to give up a system that's meeting their needs, maybe badly, right? But meeting them without providing some other way for them to get those needs met. So what we need to do when we design solutions to climate change, we absolutely have to keep not just our biological needs in mind, but our social needs in mind. We need to develop solutions that build community, that enhance people's sense of esteem and control. And we need to emphasize the ways that our new solutions can meet people's motives better than the current system. Here's an example. New Zealand had a really big push to encourage people to put solar panels on their properties. And they've got lots and lots of land where very spread out ranchers and farmers, lots of sheep. And they were not really making much headway until they realized what was going to motivate those farmers. The farmers and the ranchers really valued their autonomy and their independence. And so describing solar technology as a way to be self-reliant and independent made them feel great about themselves. And they had a tremendous uptick in people getting excited about and installing solar panels. So can we find a way to talk about our solutions and our actions in ways that help people see how they're going to meet these really important fundamental needs that we all have? And when we do that, we tap into those incredibly strong motivations that I talked about earlier. The last point I want to make is about the power of love. We will suffer and sacrifice for people and places and causes that we care about. Talking to people about who they love, what they love, where they love, is another really powerful tool that we have in our toolbox. You can see I take this stuff really seriously. So all of that was based on data and a lot of research. What I want to share with you now are some thoughts that I've been having recently, and I've started to collect some data on it. And that is wondering whether or not we can take this experience of COVID-19 and use it in a way that can help us learn some really powerful lessons. So can the COVID-19 experience change how we think about our ability to respond to climate change? Think back to that model that I talked about, right? So we evaluate our threat and we evaluate our ability to respond to that threat. Is it possible that the COVID-19 experience could make the threat of climate change more real? It's highlighted how interdependent we are and how vulnerable we are, right? When we ran out of toilet paper, I couldn't imagine why can't we get enough toilet paper? Well, everything changed, and then the supply chain got disrupted, right? It's also potentially highlighting the value and the accuracy of scientific information and scientific predictions. So that's possible. I don't have any data about that at all. So I don't know if that's true. I'm just a question I'm asking. I do have a little bit of data about this idea, however. Is it possible that looking at the tremendous collective response that we've had around the globe to fight COVID could make it seem more likely that we can fight climate change? COVID-19 resulted in the largest, most unprecedented amount of behavior change ever in the history of the human species. It's mind-boggling. People change so much and so fast. If you had told me a couple months beforehand that that would happen, I would have told you it was utterly impossible, right? So we did the impossible in response to COVID-19. We also have these examples of nature responding, right? So you probably saw the headlines or the pictures of, the canals in Venice were clear, or you could see the Himalayas in India for the first time in a generation, right? We changed our behavior, and nature responded quickly. Those experiences might make it easier for people to imagine a world in which we respond effectively to climate change. And if they can imagine that world, they're more likely to take action and more likely to make that world come to being. So with some of my students, I ran a study where we had people read one of two articles. One group, the control group, read a travel article about sites in India. And the other read an article that had this headline and talked about the fact that within a month of the shutdown, you could see things in India that you couldn't see before. And the skies were suddenly clear and the air was suddenly fresh. So what we found was the people who read about that improved air quality as a result of the shutdown, and it didn't mention climate change at all, right? No mention of climate change in the article. However, those people believed that climate change mitigation efforts would be more effective. They felt more able to perform those behaviors. They believed other people were more likely to perform those behaviors, and they were more willing to take action. So this is a new research area for me. I'm going to be collecting more data. So I don't know if it'll work, but it might work to point to what we have done as a species in response to COVID. We really can come together and change things quickly when we need to. So to wrap up, don't give up. Humans are innovative. We can change on a dime when we're motivated to. And we really are motivated by love and belonging. Second, we really need to focus on building a sense of efficacy. We can do this. We need to believe we can do it. We need to convince other people we can do it. And then suddenly we will all be making that reality come true. And then finally, we need to find solutions and find ways of talking to each other that respect each other and reinforce our most fundamental psychological needs. We need to have everybody come through this with a sense of control, a sense of understanding, a sense of worth, and a sense of belonging. I'll end with this quote that I have carried around in my brain for about 30 years now. Do the best that you can in the place where you are and be kind. It's hard to be a climate activist. We're all just going to do the best we can. So thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. That was awesome. Oh my gosh. So I understand you're willing to be open for questions.
I am, and I do, so I can take down my PowerPoint slide. I do have a couple of slides about talking to climate deniers, and so if let me take down my slides, and then if people ask about that, I can put them back up.
Great. So there's a couple of different ways you can ask questions. You can put questions in the chat, and there's also, if you go and click on the participants, there's an opportunity to raise your hand. So you click on participants and find your, there should be a little raise hand function there. So I see in the chat that Laurel says, everyone noticed the absence of pollution when people stayed home and stopped driving. But when governments, quote unquote, reopened the economy and people started going out more, everyone forgot about the clearer skies because they were glad to go out again.
Yeah, so that's not actually a question, but a statement. Yeah. And it's true, right? So I think what you're hitting on there, Laurel, is that just because COVID-19 happened doesn't mean that we will magically have learned all these lessons and suddenly change. And so I think the way that I'm thinking about COVID-19 as a potential communication tool is that we need to use it mindfully and remind people. Remember back in April when the air was so clear? Wow, wasn't it amazing that with just a month of changing what we did, nature would respond so well? I think those kinds of messages, if people continue to hear them and be reminded of them, can help us think differently and more optimistically. But if we don't actively engage with those ideas, yeah, people are going to forget. It's just they're going to go right back to business as usual.
Great, thank you for that. So I'm watching again. You can raise your hand, or if you want to type into the chat, you click on the chat at the bottom, and you can put a question in, or just say unmute me, and I'll invite you to unmute. I'll have to say, Cindy, one thing I do is when I travel, or when I used to travel, I would mention like, oh, look how stressed the trees look to my Uber driver or whatever. So there's this like paying attention, because we can easily ignore what's happening with nature, right? But we can also pay attention to what's happening.
That's a great strategy, Renee. So basically what you were doing was highlighting the threat side of things, right? You were pointing out the problem that otherwise is really easy to ignore. Yeah, that's great.
It's like, oh, there it is, right? The elephant in the room. All right, come on, folks. You're usually a really chatty, maybe I'll, so again, you can go to, if there's a reactions button at the bottom too. So if you want to, maybe I'll put this into gallery view. So if you want to do maybe the, I don't know. There's the
I can also say the couple of things that I was gonna say about talking to climate change deniers. But I see that Walter has his hand up.
All right, Walter does. And I see a couple of other questions too. So let's go with Walter, and then Bob and Beth have a question. And why don't I see Walter's hand? All right, so go ahead. Walter, let me unmute you. Oh, this is, sorry,
I think he has to do something on his end to unmute.
I have to do something. I think I have to let him unmute himself. So
okay, I'm unmuted.
Great.
One of the things that you didn't bring up that I would be interested in your take on is what is used so much by politicians, and that is the effect on the economy, both of the COVID pandemic and also of various methods for climate change. Because when this is brought up, this tends to drive people back into themselves and into their own tribe, their own family, and to ignore some of the other things that you've talked about of social concern and participation in society as a whole. And it seems to me that that becomes one of the major, if not the major factor in whether or not something will actually be done properly to combat climate change, as well as it's one of the enemies of getting the pandemic under control as well. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. And I don't want to be too, I hope I didn't come up too naive. I actually think that we are like hanging on a knife's edge here in terms of being able to pull this off. And Walter, you alluded to the fact that, you know, when it comes down to money, sometimes we can be driven back into our tribes, right? So one thing that could happen, climate change causes incredible distress. It causes food scarcity. It causes migration, forced migration. We could see a huge uptick in warfare, racism, as we all are trying to protect ourselves, right? So that is one way that we can go. I think the economic models that I've seen are pretty clear that not dealing with climate change is more expensive than dealing with climate change. And I think that that's true of COVID as well, right? That there's the short-term cost versus the long-term cost. And so if we had done, for example, what New Zealand did with COVID-19, we would all be pretty much back to normal right now, and our economy would be getting back on its feet. Instead, we didn't do anything, and so we're going to have months more of economic downturn. So I think there are so many complicated things that we need to be able to pull off to be able to solve this. And one of them is to help people think farther into the future than we typically do. It's not impossible. There are cultures on this earth that routinely think far into the future. Our capitalist American culture doesn't happen to be one of those yet, but we might be able to pull it off. Who knows?
See, Cindy, I really liked your talk. I do have a question, though. It seems to me that it is a question of the tragedy of the commons, where the action of the individual to satisfy her or his current best interests end up working contrary to their long-term, to the long-term best interests of the collective in which they participate. So it seems to me that the convincing everyone of the ability to act requires showing how climate difficulties or climate problems, climate change is impacting them now. And that is a difficult sell unless you've just been in a forest fire in California or a hurricane in Houston or something like that. How would you, I'd be interested in any response that you could give to that.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right that that being, this is on one of the slides I didn't show, being really, really specific and concrete about the effects of climate change is a very effective strategy for helping people see the interconnected nature of everything. And, you know, I think you can probably say to almost anyone, don't you think it's been warmer the last 10 years than it was when you were a kid? And we all can say yes. So, you know, I think more and more people are having direct experience that they are attributing to climate change. In fact, there's research on that 8% that have changed their mind about climate change. One of the major reasons, the biggest reason why people are changing their mind is they're having those direct experiences. Mm-hmm. And you know, that's the sort of thing that we can also work into conversations. You know, you're talking to your dentist and you say, God, can you believe it? 60 degrees in December. When I was a kid, it was never like that. You know, we can point these things out. My dentist happens to be a climate change denier. I see that there are some comments here, and I just wonder if I should go back and read what's in the chat, or I don't know if someone else.
I can go ahead and read them to you.
Okay.
So Iman says, climate change activism requires the activist to be very informed and updated. What sites, books, or articles do you recommend to us to read in order to be more educated about climate change?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think you need to be somewhat informed and educated, but I don't think you need to be an expert, is what I would say. So there are a number of organizations out there that I personally have a lot of respect for. The Environmental Defense Fund, for example, they have lots of great information, and they also do research on the social side of things, the stuff that I'm talking about. So there's an organization called Drawdown, or there's a book called Drawdown. I can't remember what the name of the organization is, but they also have identified some key strategies for fighting climate change. I think there's actually a lot of information out there. And I would say, if you feel like you're not well informed, don't let that stop you. That would be my advice.
Great, thank you. So I have a couple of comments. One is from Mary Lang. I am surprised that we have approximately 7 years left. It seems like things are really critical now. Right,
so, you know, who knows how that person, you know, the scientists came up with that 7-year estimate, and I'm sure someone could argue with it. And I'm sure that, you know, people can come up with other estimates. That 7 years is to prevent complete climate collapse. So, so it's not like 7 years and then everything's fine. It's like 7 years to stop civilization from collapsing, right? So we have already bought some serious disruption. So hopefully that puts the 7-year thing a little bit in perspective, but it's also, of course, it's a guesstimate. We don't really know how much time we have.
Thank you. Another question from Swanee. Cindy, have you read Nature's Best Hope, A New Approach to Conservation That Starts in Your Yard by Douglas Tallamy? It describes how we can individually combat climate change by growing beautiful native species in our own yards, schools, places, and works, and parks. This is an action many people enjoy and can make a real difference in the climate.
Yeah, and you know, that's really helping to build resilient local ecosystems. And so whether, you know, I think that's part of mitigation, climate change mitigation, but it's also part of climate change adaptation, right? If we have these pockets of healthy ecosystems, they're going to be more likely to function and survive. So that's great that you're doing that.
Great, thank you. So Ann Andrews has another question. What are group actions should we give priority here in Ohio or in Kent, Ohio?
Yeah. So this is just my opinion, and I'm a psychologist, so take it for what it's worth. I have a tremendous respect for Citizens Climate Lobby. That's an organization that they are very bipartisan, they are very results focused, and they are working to pass carbon tax legislation. And they are, I just think they're a real class act, and they're also very, very data driven. So I think pushing for legislation, obviously voting for candidates that are going to fight climate change is completely essential. So if you don't have a plan to vote yet, make it right now. I bet everybody here does. I also think that we can put pressure on our local governments to, for example, do things to bring down the energy use of their buildings. So investing in energy efficiency, investing in hybrid fleet vehicles for city vehicles. I don't know what your utility source is, but here in Oberlin, we have a municipal utility. So we lobbied very hard. Now we have a 100% renewable electricity portfolio. So those are all things that you all can be working on beyond all the stuff that I'm sure you're already doing, like biking whenever you can, and eating less meat and all that other stuff. But we really need to also be making changes on the systemic level, on that collective level.
Great, thank you. So I'm seeing some gratitude from Iman. Thank you very much. And from Gwen, I'm seeing the tragedy of the commons has been really way oversold. We are really communal.
Yeah, I agree. We really are communal.
If you're looking for discussions with people who are talking about, and in some cases taking action, look and join the Deep Adaptation Forum.
Oh, I've never heard of that.
Gwen, if you can put a link into the chat, that would be awesome, so people could download that. Great. So I also want to say, from personal experience about like what we can do locally, I have a little lot in Kent, Ohio, and we have a permaculture garden and a pollinator garden out front. And it's amazing the diversity of species we have in our little postage stamp yard. So yeah. From my own experience, I can say, 1 yard at a time, we can make a difference in diversity and biodiversity, because species extinction is a thing, right?
And just a reminder, so Renee's little postage stamp, so that postage stamp is awesome. That postage stamp is also sending a message to her neighbors and to everyone around her. And so every time we do something, we're doing the good of the thing that we're doing, and we're sending a message, and that message ripples out. And both of those things are tremendously important.
Yeah, great. So I have recorded this, I'm typing some things in the chat. I missed the very beginning, so Cindy, we may need to just like get a little piece of your introduction, but I got most of it. But oh my gosh, this has been amazing. Such gratitude to you and all of you who came tonight. This has been inspirational for me, and inspirational and not Pollyannish, right? That's what we need to be. We need to be clear-eyed and hopeful. So I appreciate that from you, Cindy. And if you want to put gratitudes into the chat, please do. So much wonderfulness here. And we will post the video on the Kent Environmental Council website. Bob, do you have a question? I can ask you to unmute. Okay, go ahead, Bob.
No, I was just going to comment on your wonderful garden, that it's not just, when you look at it, you see this variety of flowers and plants. But I did my research currently is with native bees. And so I spent, what was it, maybe 2 hours, maybe less than 2 hours. And we found such a wide variety of bees, native bees, some of which were not common bees. And so it shows that this is more than just diversity of plants, but that it leads to a diversity, building a diversity of things that depend on those plants, and then so on and so forth. It builds out so that when we do what we may seem to think as a single action, planting a wide variety of plants in our yard, it turns out to have a much broader effect on the ecosystem as a whole. And if you doubt that, you have only to drive by Renee's place, see it in action.
You're all invited.
Yeah, that was
amazing.
That's the only thing I wanted to say. But it's beautiful. Thank you so much, Cindy, for your time and efforts here. This has been a great fall forum.
Oh, you're welcome. It really was a pleasure to put it together and think it all through. So thank you.
So Bob Wilson, I see you have your sharing.
Yes, Cindy, I wanted to send you our poetry book that we were talking about earlier. I don't know if you can see it here.
I can, yeah.
This is our book of pollination poems, and I'll get your address and send you a copy. I could also send it virtually. We've got a PDF version if you prefer. But anyhow, I would
love a paper copy, actually.
Paper too. I wanted to thank you. And I also wanted to, I'm also a big fan of Renee's garden. But I think in keeping with this talk in general, if we could get a larger perspective and get up and see all the little island gardens in a community like Kent or Oberlin, and imagine that from a pollinator standpoint. I'm always amazed at the unusual insects that come in. And if you think of it as, well, they don't have that far to go because Renee's is just down the street. Mm-hmm. There's a master gardener across the street. There's somebody down on lake. And viewed from above, there's a lot of these spots. And it functions more like a much larger ecosystem if you have a lot of these little spots because they feed into each other. And it sort of elevates the whole.
Yeah.
So I won't go on and on because we've had a nice evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Let's see, there's other gratitudes. Thank you so much for giving us hope and motivation to continue what we are doing. Thank you, Cindy. Thoroughly enjoyed your uplifting presentation. We all need a little uplift these days. And we'll try to get some of the links out. I'll collect them and I'll send them out. Anybody who registered, I will send it out. We can also send some links out in the KEC newsletter. So awesome. So just gratitude for you all. Thank you for attending this first virtual version. Thank you, Cindy, for traveling through the interwebs from Oberlin to well, again, we'll put together a little care package for you. Bob, I'll ask you for some poetry things, and I want to get you a black squirrel mug and other things that are very Kentish.
Excellent.
Show you our gratitude and
I look forward to that.
So, anyway, thank you so much, everyone. I just feel so filled from this. You know, I have so many things that are not going so well, but this is great. I love you all and appreciate, you know, how all of us care for the environment and like we're gonna like change the culture, right? That's our job. So yeah, thumbs up, right? Thank you all. All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, be well, everyone. Thank you. So much gratitude. Good night.
Bye.